This morning will be part 2 of considering Jesus and the woman at the well. I'd like to go ahead and begin the reading this morning at verse 1 of John chapter 4, and then we'll pick up and focusing on the things from verses 16 to 26. And here we read, "Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman from Samaria came to draw water. And Jesus said to her, 'Give me a drink.' For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, 'How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans.' Jesus answered her, 'If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, "Give me a drink," you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water.' The woman said to him, 'Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock.' And Jesus said to her, 'Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life.' And the woman said to him, 'Sir, give me this water, so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water.'" After trying to turn the Samaritan woman's attention from physical to spiritual things, Jesus goes on here as the conversation continues to reveal his power of insight and more spiritual truth. And so we see here that the conversation turns a bit more personal. Jesus revealed that he knew her person. In verses 16 to 18 we read, Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." And the woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." Jesus knew her. He knew about her life. He knew the condition. He knew the situation of her life. He knew her character, and he revealed to her his divine knowledge by telling her some facts about her life. And then what we see is she confessed a little. She didn't have a husband. But Jesus then went on to reveal even more. He acknowledged that she was right, but there was more. Jesus revealed the depth of his insight into her life. And coming to Christ, we come to understand some things about God. We come to understand more fully his love, his grace, his mercy, the adequacy of his provision, his wisdom, and the list goes on. However, we are also to come to understand some things about ourselves, that we are not right without a right relationship with him. We must acknowledge our shortcomings as we recognize only in Christ are our greatest spiritual needs going to be met. It's not a matter of just adding Jesus to our life. Jesus needs to become our life. If we've just added Jesus to our life, we're probably going to just continue to go on and doing the other things that we do. No, Jesus needs to become our life and to be open to allowing him to transform our life into the beings that he desires us to be. This revelation of our sinfulness is not intended to drive us away as feeling unworthy, but in drawing us near to receive the blessing that we need and the blessing that God desires to bestow through Christ, and that is the salvation of our soul, the adequacy of the cleansing that we can receive by Jesus. And the woman's perception then shifted here as in verse 19 we see, the woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." Her attention was gained a little bit further. She recognized that Jesus had insight into her life that not just anybody would have. This is the same as earlier with Nathanael in John chapter 1, verses 47 to 49, when because of what Jesus acknowledged he knew, Nathanael did accept who Jesus was. From Jesus' acknowledgement began then another shift in the conversation, a deeper discussion of worship. And it was the woman who here seems to shift the subject. As verse 20 says, "Our fathers worship on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Moving the conversation from water to husbands to worship. Did she change the subject to avoid perhaps a disagreeable subject, something that she did not want to address about her background? Or in recognizing Jesus as a prophet, did she hope for some clarity on the subject of worship? She noted the existing difference that there was between Jews and Samaritans in how they worshiped and where that worship took place. And in acknowledging Jesus as a prophet and as a Jew, that may have brought her mind to that difference between the Samaritans and the Jews, especially in the area of worship. As for the Jews, the location was in Jerusalem, the temple, the place where God's name was, where there was this sense of going there to meet God, even though life was lived in the presence of God. God said he'd choose a place in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 1 through 5, before the nation entered into the promised land. Jerusalem and the temple became that place, as 1 Kings 12, 26 to 29 notes in the building of the temple there during the reign of King Solomon. And God promised to meet his children there, and thus the Jews believed only those who worshipped in Jerusalem were acceptable to God. But the location for the Samaritans was this mountain, Mount Gerizim. Our fathers, as she refers to it, remember, this would have been looking back to the 10 tribes who, under the leadership of Jeroboam, who became king over Israel, broke away from the house of David during the reign of Rehoboam, who was king of Judah. Calf worship was set up on altars at Bethel and Dan so that the people would not go to Jerusalem. We find this in 1 Kings chapter 12 and verses 26 to 29. One writer says the Jews had persistently charged the Samaritans with forsaking God and leaving Jerusalem and the temple in which God had recorded his name and where he promised to meet his people at the mercy seat, and had made a calf at Bethel and met to worship at Mount Gerizim instead of Jerusalem. Now, we've already addressed last week about the mixed race of people that were there in Samaritans, mixing with the Assyrians. But Jesus' response here is that she worshiped what she did not know. The Samaritans worshiped what they didn't know. The view of God in a special relationship only to the Samaritans was not right. Needed to come to understand and needed to come to know that God and the salvation of God was extended to all. But the Jews also in Jerusalem needed to understand that reality as well. But Jesus does address the idea that salvation comes from the Jews through the family of Abraham. Through Jews true to the worship of God, from Jews was the promised Messiah, was the promised Christ. Well, Jesus moves here on to then true worship and clarifying things. Verses 21 to 24. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know. For salvation is from the Jews, but the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Jesus says the time is coming. But he also says, not only is the time coming, he says the time is here. The time is now. Now that time is here. Worship that Jesus tried to draw her attention to, that we also must understand, is not spatial. It is not confined to one place. Worship not exclusively in either place, Mount Gerizim or in Jerusalem. A time when the locality would have nothing to do with religion and worship, verse 21. However, even today, there are those who would focus on pilgrimages and the sort of arriving at a destination. And even though we would recognize we do come to this place, we do assemble often at a church building, at a particular location to worship together, that is out of convenience and a place, but the focus is more on the worshipers who are assembling than it is the place, than it is the structure, as we could easily worship together even outside. So we do come together for a special purpose, to worship together and encourage one another in that worship together. But are we just relegating the worship of our life to just one location and one slot of time during each week? More about the worshipers rightly worshiping than that place. In Matthew chapter 18 and verse 20, there Jesus made the statement, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them." What a beautiful picture of the fellowship of the Lord with those who come together. And it had nothing to do with a particular place, but wherever it was that they gathered, he was there with them. But the true worshipers are those who worship in spirit and in truth. It was time for the Samaritan and Jewish rivalry to come to an end and to worship in spirit and in truth. Not mere ritual, not formal, local, or mechanical, as it was for many of the Jews and for even some today, but worship that is from the heart involved, and the spirit molded by God's truth. We can't just go through the motions. It is worship in spirit and in truth. Spirit as opposed to mere motions of the body and rituals and ceremonies and objects. And truth as opposed to insincerity, misunderstanding, or even of worship of our own choosing. These are the kind of worshipers that the Lord is seeking, the Father seeks. It's worship that must be regulated by God's truth. Spirit and truth, not one without the other. It's not so much a setting or even the ambience of a place, but it is the ambience of the heart, and the heart that is connecting with God in worship. For God himself is spirit, not limited by time and space, and worship is not merely outward, but begins within from our spirit. Not just outward conformity, but inward transforming in accordance with God's will. And yes, indeed, the Messiah will explain. Verse 25 says, "The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." Both the Jews and the Samaritans lived in expectation of the coming Messiah. When he comes, he will tell us all things. With the Messiah coming would be the making known of the full and the perfect law of God. She was trying to understand. She was listening to what Jesus was saying, and she's looking forward to a time when she would have fuller understanding. And Jesus' response is, I who speak to you am he, verse 26. Quite the shift in the focus here. How more direct could Jesus have been than he was with the woman here? I who speak am he. I think it's very interesting how much clearer Jesus was with the Samaritan woman than he was with many of the rulers of the day who kept questioning him about who he was. I believe Jesus saw the openness of this woman to see and to accept, and he makes it very clear to her who it is that she is. And we know, as we'll note in our text next week, of her going back into Sychar. Water no longer being important to her, as we noted last week, as she ultimately leaves the water jar there and goes into Sychar to tell the people, could this be the Messiah? And they have an opportunity to hear him as well. I who speak to you am he. The Messiah, when the Messiah comes, he will explain all things. Well, the Messiah was there, and the Messiah was explaining all things. In view of the Messiah, what marks our worship? What marks the worship, not just here, as we gather together, but in our life? In Romans chapter 12, and verses 1 through 2, Paul wrote, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Present your bodies as a living sacrifice. And we don't die. And we could die for the cause, be persecuted at that point, but we are to live for the cause of Christ. We are to give our life as a living sacrifice. That is our spiritual worship, our life given to Christ. Not just Christ being added to our life again, as I noted earlier, but for Christ to really be our life as we have given ourselves over to him. Jesus gave his life for us, and we need to give our lives to him in a response to all the blessings that he has provided for us. And as we allow him, as we humbly surrender to him and allow him to transform our lives from the inside out. As we gather, though we appreciate and enjoy what we do, let us remember it is not to be, we don't come together to be entertained, but to be engaged in worship with God, as God is the audience of our worship. Our worship is to be done to please God. Also, let us not limit worship to just this time and place. Life in all aspects ought to be offered as worship to God, as he is our God and we belong to him. And we look forward to when we will spend eternity with him. And so may our life be given as a living sacrifice as we walk through each day that the Lord gives.